The last amber kiss of the sun had long since withdrawn from the highest peaks surrounding the quiet valley of Eldoria, leaving behind a deepening velvet sky, pierced first by the boldest stars, then by a myriad of their shyer companions. Down, in the valley floor, where the air was already cool and fragrant with the scent of pine, damp earth, and the close, comforting aroma of his resting flock, Caleb, a shepherd whose 57 years were etched in the kind lines around his eyes, and the quiet strength of his weathered hands, moved through the final rituals of his day. His sheep, a woolly, trusting mass, were settled for the night within the familiar embrace of the stone and thorn boma he maintained near his small, sturdy cabin. Their soft bleating had subsided into contented sighs, and the occasional gentle rustle as one shifted its position. The stream that wound its way through Eldoria, the lifeblood of this secluded haven, murmured its timeless song, a gentle counterpoint to the hushed whisper of the night breeze through the tall grasses. Caleb, a man whose conversations were more, often with the sky, the stream, and his God, than with other humans, felt the familiar weariness of a day spent under the vast sky, guiding his flock to fresh pastures, his crook his constant companion, his dogs his loyal deputies. Yet tonight, as on some other nights, an almost imperceptible thread of disquiet wove itself through the welcome fatigue, a subtle tension that held the immediate peace of true sleep just beyond his easy grasp. He stood for a long while at the door of his cabin, a mug of warm goat's milk sweetened with a touch of wild honey, cupped in his hands. The steam rose in the cool air, carrying the comforting scent. He wasn't consciously delaying sleep. Rather, he was allowing the transition, the letting go of the day's vigilance, to occur at its own unhurried pace. The valley, his home for almost his entire life, was a place of profound beauty and solitude. He knew its every contour, every subtle shift in the wind's song, every secret hiding place of the rarest wildflowers. It was here he had learned the rhythms of nature, and in those rhythms, he had discerned the steady, patient hand of the Creator. His faith was not one of elaborate doctrines or theological debates. It was a simple, bedrock trust, forged in the silence of lonely dawns, in the awe of star-filled nights, in the quiet miracle of new lambs born each spring. Yet, even for a man so accustomed to solitude and so anchored in a quiet faith, the human heart, with its capacity for memory and concern, could sometimes prove a restless companion in the quiet hours. Have you ever felt that, dear listener, that subtle hum beneath the surface of your own weariness, a thought or a feeling, perhaps unnamed, that keeps the gentle tide of sleep from fully claiming you? It is in these moments, isn't it, that the soul often yearns for a deeper kind of stillness, a peace that originates beyond itself. Caleb's disquiet tonight wasn't a sharp anxiety, not a fear of any immediate danger to his flock or himself. The boma was secure, the night was calm. His dogs, old Shep and young Bess, lay twitching in their own contented dreams near the hearth inside. It was something more ephemeral, a shadow from the past, perhaps, or a gentle premonition, not of doom, but of the inherent fragility of all earthly peace. He thought, as he sometimes did when this mood settled upon him, of a particularly harsh winter years ago, a winter that had tested his flock and his own spirit to their limits. He had lost a few of his older, weaker ewes that year, despite his best efforts, and the memory, though softened by time, still carried a faint ache of responsibility, of the shepherd's inevitable encounters with loss. It wasn't guilt, precisely, but a poignant awareness of his own human limitations in the face of nature's sometimes unforgiving power. And perhaps, interwoven with that old sorrow, was a newer, almost formless concern for the changing seasons of his own life, the subtle shifts in his own strength, the unspoken question of who would tend this valley, this flock, when his own crook was finally laid down. These were not thoughts he dwelt on obsessively, but they were there, like smooth, worn stones at the bottom of a clear stream, occasionally visible when the waters of daily activity grew still. "Lord," he breathed, the word a soft exhalation, mingling with the steam from his mug. "You see the seasons, within and without." His prayer, as always, was simple, direct, an unadorned conversation. He pictured the divine not as a distant potentate, but as the great shepherd, the one who Scripture said knew his sheep by name, who led them to green pastures and still waters, whose rod and staff were a comfort. Could that divine shepherding extend to him, an earthly shepherd, with his own small flock and his own quiet burdens? His heart, and a lifetime of answered prayers, often answered not in dramatic interventions, but in quiet shifts of perspective, in unexpected provisions, in the slow dawning of peace, affirmed that it could. He imagined the vast, silent, expanse of the night sky above him as a comforting blanket, held by a loving hand. He thought of the biblical patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who were also shepherds, men who had walked with God in the solitude of wide-open spaces, who had known hardship and blessing, who had learned to trust in promises unseen. Their stories, read many times by the light of his oil lamp, were a source of quiet encouragement, a reminder that his own solitary path was part of a much larger ancient narrative of faith. He took a slow sip of the warm milk. The sweetness of the honey was a gentle counterpoint to the slightly tangy flavor of the goat's milk, a familiar, comforting taste. He focused on the sounds of the valley, the gentle murmur of the stream, a constant, soothing presence, the occasional soft stamp of a sheep in the boma, the whisper of the wind in the pines that clothed the lower slopes of the mountains, a sound like the distant breathing of the earth itself. These were the sounds of his peace, a symphony of natural quietude that usually lulled him easily to sleep. Tonight, however, he consciously chose to listen more deeply, not just with his ears, but with his heart, seeking in these familiar sounds a fresh reassurance of God's presence, his order, his gentle care. He remembered the story of David, the shepherd boy who became a king, who wrote so many psalms that spoke of finding refuge in God, of being led and restored by Him. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The words echoed in Caleb's mind, not as a rote recitation but as a profound, lived truth. Want for what? Not just for physical sustenance, though that was always provided in this fertile valley, but want for peace, for security, for a sense of belonging, for the deep soul rest that no earthly comfort could ultimately provide. He began, in his mind, to walk through his day, not to relive its anxieties, but to consciously release its small burdens. The slight lameness he had noticed in one of the older rams, he pictured that concern, that small knot of worry, and offered it to the great physician, the one who Scripture said cared even for the sparrows. The patch of hillside where the grazing had been thinner than he'd hoped. He released his concern for future provision into the hands of the one who owned the cattle on 1,000 hills, the one who had carpeted this very valley with abundance for generations. The unspoken weariness in his own bones, a little deeper than usual today, he acknowledged it, and then offered it up as well, trusting in the promise of renewed strength for those who wait upon the Lord. With each mental act of surrender, he felt a subtle loosening, a gentle unwinding within his own spirit, like a tightly coiled rope slowly relaxing its tension. It wasn't a dramatic, instantaneous cure for his disquiet, but a gradual, perceptible shift towards a more profound calm. The stars above seemed to grow a little brighter, their distant ancient light a silent affirmation of a vaster, more encompassing peace. He thought of the still waters mentioned in that beloved psalm. Where were those still waters for his own soul tonight? Perhaps they were not a physical place, but a state of being, a quietude cultivated within, even amidst the murmuring streams and the whispering wind. It was a stillness found in ceasing his own internal striving, his own subtle efforts to manage every outcome, to control every variable. It was the stillness of trust, the quiet confidence that God was indeed in control, that his plans were good, that his love was unwavering. Caleb closed his eyes for a moment, leaning against the rough-hewn wooden door frame, and imagined his soul as a small mountain tarn, its surface agitated by the winds of his small concerns. And then he pictured a divine hand gently calming those winds, allowing the surface of the tarn to grow smooth, still perfectly reflecting the serene majesty of the star-filled sky above. This image, simple yet profound, brought a fresh wave of peace, a deeper settling in his spirit. He considered the nature of his flock, their utter dependence on him for guidance, for protection, for sustenance. They did not worry about where their next meal would come from, or whether the boma would hold against predators. They simply trusted him, their shepherd, to care for them. And in their simple, unanxious trust, there was a profound lesson for his own heart. Was he not also a sheep in a much larger divine flock, under the care of a shepherd infinitely wise, infinitely powerful, infinitely loving? The humility of that realization was deeply comforting. It released him from the illusion of self-sufficiency, from the burdensome weight of ultimate responsibility. He was a steward, yes, a caretaker, but the ultimate ownership, the ultimate oversight, belonged to another. And in that truth, there was immense freedom, immense peace. The night air grew a little cooler, carrying a sharper hint of pine. He drew his worn woolen cloak a little tighter around his shoulders. The warmth of the milk in his mug had faded, but a deeper warmth was beginning to spread through his chest. The warmth of a heart slowly yielding to the gentle invitation of divine peace. He was not forcing it, not demanding it, but simply creating the space for it, like preparing a guest room for a beloved, long-awaited visitor. He swept his mind clean of the day's clutter, of the lingering shadows of past sorrows, of the faint anxieties about an unknown future. He was practicing what the scriptures called casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. It was an act of faith, an act of will, but also, increasingly, an act of a heart that had tasted and seen that the Lord is good, that his burden is light, that his yoke is easy. He opened his eyes again, and the valley seemed even more serene, more suffused with a quiet, holy presence. The stars blazed with a silent, ancient fire, their light traveling unimaginable distances to reach his quiet corner of the world, a testament to a faithfulness that transcended time and space. The murmur of the stream was a gentle lullaby, the whisper of the wind a soothing benediction. His own disquiet, which had felt like a subtle barrier between him and the night's peace, was now dissolving, like mist in the warmth of a rising sun. It hadn't been banished by intellectual argument or by sheer force of will, but had simply yielded to a greater, more encompassing peace, a peace that flowed from the very heart of God. He felt his eyelids growing heavy, a familiar, welcome sensation. The invitation to sleep was no longer a distant hope, but a present reality, a gentle tide drawing him towards its restorative embrace. He was ready. The shepherd, weary from his labors, was ready to be shepherded into the serene pastures of God-given rest. Settle in now, dear listener, as Caleb stands on the threshold of that peace. What memories, what subtle concerns might be casting a shadow over your own heart tonight? Can you, like him, visualize those cares and offer them into the hands of the great shepherd, the one who promises to lead you beside still waters and restore your soul? Allow the quiet beauty of this secluded valley, the gentle sounds of the night, the simple faith of this humble shepherd, to draw you into a deeper state of tranquility. Let go of the day, release your burdens, and prepare to receive the profound, healing gift of rest that your spirit so deeply craves. Let the story continue to unfold, and may your heart, like Caleb's, find its way to that perfect peace that is found only in him. The journey into his calm is beginning. Caleb turned from the cabin door, the now empty mug still warm in his hand, and moved into the dim, firelit interior of his small dwelling. The hearth, where a few logs smoldered with a deep orange glow, cast flickering, gentle shadows on the rough-hewn wooden walls and the few simple furnishings. A sturdy table, a couple of handmade chairs, shelves holding his meager collection of books, mostly well-thumbed scriptures, and a few volumes on animal husbandry and local flora. Old Shep, his grizzled border collie, thumped his tail once against the stone hearth, without opening his eyes, a sleepy acknowledgement of his master's presence. Young Bess, apart. Caleb pushed himself gently away from the doorframe of his cabin. The now kelpie mix with boundless daytime energy lay curled in a tight ball, emitting the occasional soft sigh and twitch of her paws as she chased dream rabbits. The atmosphere within the cabin was one of profound, rustic peace, a sanctuary empty mug still cradled in his hands. The slight chill in the night air was a reminder that true warmth, the kind that settled deep in the bones and quieted the spirit, came not from external comforts alone, but from that earned through honest labor and simple living, a haven against the wildness and the vastness of the surrounding valley. He placed inner hearth where faith kept its steady glow. He stepped inside his small dwelling, the scent of wood smoke from the dying, the mug on the table, and went about the last few rituals that marked the end of his waking day. He added a small embers in the fireplace, a familiar, comforting perfume. His two dogs, Old Shep with his grizzled muzzle and young dry log to the fire, not so much for heat, as the night was mild, but for the companionable glow, and Bess with her eager, intelligent eyes, thumped their tails in sleepy greeting but didn't rise, content in their master, the subtle, reassuring scent of wood smoke that would linger through the night. He checked the simple latch on the cabin door, ensuring it was secure, a habit ingrained more by long practice than by any real fear of intrusion in this secluded place. His movements, his presence, and the security of their shared home. This cabin, built by his own hands and those of his father before him, was more than just shelter. It was a sanctuary, a place where generations of quiet faith had been lived out, were slow, deliberate, each action a small, quiet step in the gentle unwinding of his day, a gradual preparation, its rough-hewn timbers seemingly saturated with unspoken prayers and the peaceful rhythms of a life lived close to the earth, and for the complete surrender of sleep. The peace that had begun to settle over him at the doorway was deepening now, seeping into his bones like the warmth from the hearth, a comforting, pervasive presence. His thoughts no longer troubled its creator. He moved about the single room, with the unhurried, economical movements of a man entirely at home in his surroundings. He added a small log to the embers, not for significant heat, but for the companionable cheer of its glow by the earlier tendrils of disquiet, meandered like the stream outside his cabin, flowing through familiar, comforting landscapes, of faith night, and the assurance of easily rekindled warmth in the morning. He rinsed his mug in the simple basin, the splash. He remembered the story of Jacob, wrestling with the angel at Peniel until the breaking of the day. Jacob had emerged of water, a soft sound in the prevailing quiet. Each small, mundane action was performed with a sense Caleb's of peaceful, from that struggle limping, but also blessed, with a new name and a deeper understanding of God. Caleb felt that deliberateness, a continuation of the letting go process that had begun outside. These were the rituals that helped to mark his own small wrestlings, the quiet battles with worry or doubt that sometimes visited him in the solitary hours, were perhaps the boundary between the vigilance of the day and the surrender of the night, a gentle pathway into rest. The stars, a microcosm of that ancient encounter. He wasn't wrestling with a celestial being, but with his own human frailties, his own creaturely anxieties. And if he persevered, if he held on in faith, even through a night of invisible, now only as faint glimmers through the small, deep-set window, seemed to draw his gaze, their immense, silent witness, a constant reminder of a perspective far vaster than his own small concerns. His thoughts, now gentler, less sane, he too often found a blessing in the morning, a renewed sense of peace, a clearer perspective, a deeper focused on specific worries, drifted to the story of Jacob at Peniel, wrestling with the angel until the break of day assurance of God's unwavering presence. Sleep, when it finally came after such a wrestling, felt like that blessing, a tangible sign, refusing to let go until he received a blessing. Caleb had always found that story both perplexing and profoundly moving. He wasn't of having been touched and changed. He thought of the manna in the wilderness, provided fresh each morning for that wrestling tonight, not in any agonistic sense. His disquiet had been a more subtle thing. Yet he, Israelites, it was a daily lesson in trust, a tangible reminder of God's constant sufficient provision. One couldn't hoard it. It wouldn't last. Each day required a fresh dependence. A fresh looking to the provider understood that longing for a blessing, for a tangible assurance of God's presence and favor, especially in the vulnerable hours. Caleb felt that peace, true soul peace, was a bit like that manna. It wasn't something of the night. Perhaps his own form of wrestling had been that quiet, conscious act of releasing his cares. He could store up from a previous good day and rely on indefinitely. Each evening he needed to come afresh to the source, of choosing trust over anxiety, of patiently waiting for the peace of God to descend and envelop him, and the blessing to release the day's specific burdens, and to receive a fresh impartation of that divine tranquility. And sleep sought was not a dramatic revelation, but the simple, profound gift of deep, untroubled sleep, the kind that knitted up the raveled sleeve of care and restored not just the body, but the soul. He unlaced his sturdy was the ultimate receptive posture, the time when, having done all he could, he simply opened his hands, metaphorically speaking, to worn leather boots, the boots that had carried him countless miles over the rugged terrain of Eldoria, and set them neatly receive this heavenly bread for his spirit. This understanding brought a sense of release from the pressure to maintain peace by the door, ready for the new day. This small act, too, felt symbolic, a laying aside of the tools through his own efforts, replacing it with a gentle reliance on God's ongoing daily grace, his small sleeping of his trade, a preparation for a different kind of journey, the inward journey of sleep. He thought of the Israelites' bunk was built into an alcove at the far end of the cabin, a cozy, cave-like space lined with sheep in the wilderness, their sandals on their feet, and their staffs in their hands as they ate. The first Passover, ready for immediate departure. His situation was different. He was preparing not for a journey of escape, but for a journey of renewal skins that were soft and warm. He kept a single tallow candle on a small shelf beside it, and he lit this now, its small, steady flame casting a gentle, localized glow, a soft contrast to the more diffuse light from. Yet there was a similar sense of readiness, a quiet anticipation of what the night might bring, not in terms of external the hearth. As he sat on the edge of his bunk, preparing to lie down, his gaze fell upon a small carved wooden events, but in terms of inner restoration. His gaze fell upon a small carved wooden sheep, a simple figurine shepherd's crook that leaned in the corner, a gift from his own father when Caleb was just a boy, learning the ways his father had made for him when he was a boy, which now sat on the rough mantelpiece above the hearth, it of the flock. It was worn smooth with age and use, its wood darkened to a rich patina. It was worn smooth by years of handling, its painted fleece faded, yet it was a treasured memento. It reminded him not only of his father's love, but of his own lifelong vocation, a calling that felt as much a part of him, symbol of his livelihood, his identity, his responsibility. But it was also, in a deeper sense, a symbol of guidance, as his own name. He thought of the many parables Jesus had told involving sheep and shepherds, The lost sheep sought and protection, echoing the psalmist's words about God's rod and staff bringing comfort. Tonight, as he prepared to lay aside his own crook, he felt a profound reassurance that the divine shepherd's crook remained ever vigilant, with diligent love, the good shepherd laying down his life for his flock. These were not just quaint agricultural analogies. Caleb knew ever protective, watching over him and his flock through the silent hours of darkness. He remembered Jesus' parable of the shepherd who left the 99 sheep in the open country to go after the one that was lost. They were profound revelations of God's own heart, his tender, sacrificial, pursuing love for humanity. And to sheer tenacity of that love, the relentless pursuit of the one, had always moved Caleb deeply. He knew, from his own experience, be a shepherd, even in his own humble way, felt like a small participation in that divine archetype. A sacred trust, the anxiety of a missing lamb, the diligence required to search for it, the immense relief and joy of finding it. This understanding brought a sense of dignity to his often solitary and unglamorous work, and it deepened his desire safe. And to imagine that God's love for each individual soul was like that, only infinitely greater, infinitely more to be a faithful steward, both of his earthly flock and of his own inner life. He remembered a time, many persistent, was a thought that filled him with a sense of awe and profound security. If that shepherd was willing to leave the years ago, when a fierce blizzard had swept through the valley unexpectedly early in the autumn, he had been caught out on 99 for the one, then surely he was intimately aware of the needs, the fears, the weariness of this one, the high pastures with his flock, far from the safety of the boma. For 2 days and nights he had humble shepherd in his small cabin in the valley of Eldoria. That assurance was a balm to any lingering trace of battled the wind and the driving snow, keeping his sheep huddled together, moving them slowly towards lower ground, his own strength quiet. The sounds of the night outside were a gentle, familiar symphony. The stream's constant murmur, the wind pushed to its absolute limit. He had prayed then with a desperation he rarely felt, a raw cry for help, from the depths of his soft sigh in the pines, the occasional distant hoot of an owl, the faint, contented rustling from being. And help had come, not in a sudden, miraculous cessation of the storm, but in an unexpected surge of endurance, the sheep in the boma. These were not disturbances, but elements of the deep, abiding peace of this valley, within himself, in the instinctive wisdom his dogs had shown in guiding the flock through near whiteout conditions, in the discovery of peace that felt ancient, almost sacred. He had lived his life to this soundtrack, and it was as comforting, and of a small, sheltered ravine he hadn't known existed, where they found temporary respite. They had eventually made it back, as intrinsic to his being as his own heartbeat. Tonight, these sounds seemed to be weaving themselves into a lullaby. A gentle, exhausted but safe, every sheep accounted for. The memory was still vivid, a testament not to his own heroism, but to an invitation to surrender to the restorative embrace of sleep. He felt his body growing heavier, his eyelids drooping with a pleasant weariness, the strength and a guidance that had come from beyond himself. And the sleep that had finally claimed him after that ordeal had been one transition from the day's watchfulness to the night's repose was almost complete. He lay down on the deepest, most profound of his life, a sleep of utter exhaustion, yes, but also of overwhelming gratitude and sheepskins, their soft woolliness a comforting cushion beneath him. He pulled a thick, hand-woven woolen blanket, another a renewed, unshakable trust in God's providential care. Tonight's need for rest was less dramatic, born of the steady, cumulative weariness of daily life, not of acute crisis. Yet the same God legacy from his mother, up to his chin. The air in the alcove was cool, but under the blanket, he who had sustained him through that blizzard was present now. In the quiet of his cabin, offering a different kind of sustenance, felt a cocoon of warmth. He closed his eyes. The small flame of the candle visible for a moment through his, a different kind of peace. It was the peace that flowed not from dramatic deliverance, but from the faithful daily eyelids as a soft orange glow, soon faded as he sank deeper into the welcoming darkness. His thoughts, which had rhythms of grace, the gentle, consistent provision for all his needs, both seen and unseen. This was the daily been gently meandering, now began to slow, to fragment, like clouds dispersing after a summer shower, revealing the clear, peaceful bread of the soul, the quiet nourishment that kept his spirit resilient and his heart open. His bed was a simple wooden sky of his inner being. He was no longer actively reflecting or remembering. He was simply being, present, in the moment frame with a thick straw-filled mattress and heavy woolen blankets, a rustic but comfortable haven, as he prepared to, yielding to the natural, God-given process of sleep. A profound sense of being held, of being on lie down, he paused, as was his habit, for a moment of quiet prayer. He didn't kneel enfolded in a love that was vast, tender, and utterly reliable, permeated his being. It was the feeling a formal posture. His prayer was more a turning of his heart, a quiet communion. He gave thanks for the day child has, safe in its parents' arms, all fears banished, all needs met. Caleb, a strong, capable man for the safety of his flock, for the beauty of the valley, for the unseen blessings that had surely accompanied him. He asked his waking hours, a man who faced the sometimes harsh realities of a shepherd's life with courage and resilience, now for protection through the night, for himself and for all vulnerable creatures. And he commended his spirit into the hands of his heavenly became, in this moment of surrender, like that trusting child. He released his grip on his own strength, his own Father, trusting in his love and his watchfulness. It was a prayer of a child to a beloved parent, simple understanding, his own carefully constructed defenses, and allowed himself to be simply held. This was the essence of his faith, honest and completely devoid of pretense. He lay down, and the weariness in his limbs felt pleasant, a deep, experiential knowing that beneath him, around him, within him, were the everlasting arms, and in those arms he could now, a welcome heaviness. He pulled the blankets up, their familiar weight a comforting pressure, the faint, sweet find perfect rest, perfect peace. The valley of Eldoria slept under a canopy of stars, and its shepherd, calm scent of the wool, mingled with the lingering aroma of wood smoke and the crispness of the night air filtering through the small window, ending his spirit to the great shepherd. Of all, was gently, peacefully, drifting into the deep healing waters of slumber, created a unique, soothing olfactory signature of his home. He closed his eyes, and the sounds of the valley seemed to wrap around him like a soft, familiar cloak. The murmur of the stream, the whisper of the wind in the pines, the occasional soft sounds from the sheep in the boma. These were the sounds of his world, and in them he heard the heartbeat of God's creation, a rhythm of peace that invited him to join its ancient, slumberous song. The disquiet that had touched him earlier had completely faded, replaced by a deep, pervasive calm, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where he was meant to be, held securely in the palm of a loving, almighty hand. The shepherd was ready to be gathered into the fold of divine rest. The journey into the deeper realms of sleep for Caleb was like a slow, gentle descent into the most serene and sheltered part of his beloved valley, a place where the winds never howled and the sun's harshest rays were softened by a canopy of ancient, benevolent trees. The last tendrils of conscious thought, like wisps of morning mist clinging to the valley floor, gradually dissolved, leaving behind a profound stillness, an unruffled surface upon which the healing touch of divine peace could do its unimpeded work. The rhythmic murmur of the stream outside his cabin, a sound as constant and as comforting as his own heartbeat, transformed into a subconscious lullaby. its gentle cadence drawing him further and further away from the shores of wakefulness. The faint, flickering glow from the dying embers in the hearth, though unseen through his closed eyelids, perhaps registered in some deep, primal part of his brain as a symbol of enduring warmth, of a protective fire that would burn steadily through the darkest hours, mirroring the unquenchable flame of God's watchful love. His body, having fully yielded to the pull of comfortable weariness, sank with a profound, satisfying weight into the soft embrace of the sheepskins and woolen blankets, a testament to the day's honest labor and the night's welcome release. In these transitional moments, as the sentinels of his conscious mind stood down from their posts, his spirit became extraordinarily open, like a high mountain meadow bathed in the soft, unfiltered light of the moon and stars. It was here, in this liminal space between wakefulness and deep sleep, that the deepest communion often occurred. It was not a communion of words or formulated prayers, but a silent soul-to-soul knowing, a profound sense of being in the presence of the holy, of being understood to the very depths of his being without the need for a single utterance. It was a sense of being known, not in a judgmental or scrutinizing way, but with an infinite tenderness, an all-encompassing acceptance that dissolved any lingering traces of self-consciousness or unworthiness. This was the peace that surpassed all understanding, a peace that flowed directly from the heart of God into the yielded heart of his child. His thoughts, if they could even be dignified with such a structured term now, were more like gentle, luminous bubbles rising from the depths of a clear, still pool, shimmering for a moment before softly bursting on the surface of his fading awareness. He might have a fleeting, dreamlike image of his flock grazing contentedly in a sun-drenched pasture, every sheep healthy, every lamb safe, a visual representation of perfect shalom, or perhaps a sense of walking beside a crystal-clear stream, its waters reflecting a sky of impossible blue, a journey with an unseen but intensely felt companion whose presence was pure joy, pure peace. These were not memories or anxieties, but rather gentle, grace-filled impressions, the soft fingerprints of God on his drowsy spirit, reassuring him that all was well, that he was beloved, that he was safe. He remembered the biblical story of Elijah, exhausted and fleeing for his life, resting under a juniper tree and being ministered to by an angel who brought him food and drink. Caleb had often felt that his own sleep, especially after days of particular trial or weariness, was a similar form of angelic ministration. Perhaps no celestial being appeared with physical sustenance, but there was a profound sense of being cared for, of having his depleted reserves, physical, emotional, and spiritual, replenished by an unseen, loving hand. This deep, restorative sleep was more than just a biological necessity. It was a sacred appointment, a time when his soul was nurtured, his spirit mended, and his connection to the divine source of all life was deepened in ways he could not consciously orchestrate, but could profoundly receive. This belief transformed sleep from a mere cessation of activity into a holy sacrament of renewal. The physical boundaries of his being seemed to soften, to become less distinct. The slight coolness of the air on his face, the gentle pressure of the blankets, the texture of the sheepskins beneath him. These sensations faded, merging into a general, pervasive feeling of warmth, security, and profound comfort. It was as if the protective embrace of the valley itself had extended into his small cabin, enfolding him in its ancient, tranquil peace. He was no longer Caleb, the individual shepherd with his specific identity and his daily concerns. He was dissolving, in a blissful, unresisting way, into the larger, timeless rhythm of creation, becoming one with the sleeping earth, the silent stars, the gently breathing night. This was not a loss of self, but a homecoming, a return to that primal state of unity with the Creator and His creation, a state where fear and separateness had no place. He recalled the words of Jesus inviting his disciples to come away by yourselves, to a desolate place and rest a while." Eldoria, his valley, was certainly a desolate place in the sense of being remote and solitary, but it was far from barren. It was teeming with life, with beauty, with the quiet, constant evidence of God's providential care. And this invitation to rest a while was one Caleb took seriously, not just in his nightly sleep, but in the very way he tried to live his life, with a rhythm that allowed for stillness, for contemplation, for simply being in the presence of God, rather than constantly doing. And sleep was the ultimate expression of that, resting a while, a complete surrender to the divine command and the divine provision for renewal. In that surrender he found not weakness, but a profound strength, a resilient peace that carried him through the demands of his solitary shepherd's life. The darkness behind his closed eyelids was now a vast, welcoming expanse, a deep, velvety sanctuary. There were no flickering images of the day's events, no restless mental projections into the future. All was still, all was calm. It was the fertile darkness of a seedbed, where unseen growth occurs. It was the restorative darkness of a deep forest, where the earth rejuvenates itself. It was the profound darkness of the night sky that allows the distant ancient light of stars to be seen in all their glory. And in this personal, sacred darkness, Caleb's spirit was being gently nurtured, his inner light rekindled, his soul steeped in a peace that flowed like a silent underground river from the very throne of God. He was being held, not by the fragile strength of his own will, but by the omnipotent, tender strength of his heavenly Father, a profound and unshakable trust, a trust that had been cultivated over a lifetime of walking with God in this valley, now formed the very atmosphere of his being. Trust in God's unfailing provision, trust in his constant presence, trust in his ultimate goodness, trust in his power to keep and to restore. This trust was not a blind leap, but a settled conviction, born of countless experiences of God's faithfulness, both in times of calm and in times of storm. It was this trust that allowed him to release his grip on consciousness so completely, to surrender to the vulnerability of sleep without a trace of fear or hesitation. He knew, with a certainty that transcended words, that he was safe, that he was loved, that he was in the best possible hands. This powerful, peaceful trust was the softest pillow, the most secure enclosure, the last coherent echoes of the outside world. The murmur of the stream, the sigh of the wind, faded into an undifferentiated symphony of perfect peace. His breathing, now as slow and regular as the turning of the earth, was the gentle rhythm of a body and spirit deeply at rest. Caleb, the shepherd of Eldoria, had answered the call of the great shepherd. He had been led into the green pastures of profound slumber, beside the still waters of divine tranquility. His soul was being restored. He was safe. He was held. He was at peace, adrift on the boundless, loving ocean of God's eternal care. The night deepened. The stars kept their silent, ancient vigil, and the shepherd slept, a beloved child in his father's keeping. The shepherd Caleb, now fully submerged in the profound, restorative ocean of deep sleep, was oblivious to the passage of time, to the silent turning of the constellations in the vast velvet sky above his secluded valley. His consciousness, like a weary traveler finally arrived at a long-sought sanctuary, had laid down its burdens and its awareness of the external world, finding instead a boundless expanse of peace, a realm where the only reality was the all-encompassing presence of the divine. The gentle rhythmic sounds of Eldoria, the murmur of the stream, the whisper of the wind through the pines, were no longer perceived by his sleeping mind. Yet their essence, their inherent tranquility, seemed to have seeped into the very fabric of his rest, contributing to the profound serenity that enveloped him. The small flickering flame of the tallow candle had long since extinguished itself, and the embers in the hearth glowed with a deep, almost imperceptible warmth, mirroring the quiet, steady flame of life that burned within him, tended and sustained by an unseen, loving hand. In this state of profound unconsciousness, where the busy loom of waking thought is stilled, the deeper, often hidden landscapes of the soul are revealed and ministered to. For Caleb, this was a time of sacred, silent healing, the small, unnoticed hurts of daily life, the subtle erosions of spirit caused by unspoken anxieties, or the natural griefs that attend a long life, were being gently addressed, not by analysis or effort, but by the pure, healing light of God's unconditional love, a light that penetrates even the deepest recesses of the unconscious mind. It was like a skilled gardener working in the quiet hours of the night, carefully tending to any bruised petals or drooping leaves on a cherished plant, ensuring that when the sun rose, it would stand strong, vibrant, and whole. The peace he experienced was not a mere absence of turmoil, but an active restorative agent, mending, soothing, and renewing him from the inside out. If dream images flickered in the depths of his slumber, they were not the disjointed, often troubling, narratives of a mind still grappling with unresolved issues. Instead, they were likely to be echoes of profound spiritual truths, presented in symbolic, sensory forms. He might feel a sensation of being effortlessly carried, like a lamb in the shepherd's arms, over rugged terrain, yet feeling no fear, only an immense sense of security and loving care. Or perhaps he experienced a sense of being immersed in an ocean of pure, liquid light, a light that was both invigorating and profoundly peaceful, cleansing him of all weariness, all shadow. These were not dreams to be remembered or interpreted in the morning. They were more like spiritual infusions, subtle recalibrations of his soul, aligning him more perfectly with the divine harmony, steeping him in a peace that was beyond words, beyond conscious comprehension. Imagine the silent, powerful work of dew, forming on the grasses of a meadow in the cool stillness of the night. Each tiny droplet, perfectly formed, reflects the purity of the heavens, and collectively, this dew refreshes and revitalizes the entire landscape. So it was with the grace that descended upon Caleb in his sleep. Each moment of profound rest was like a droplet of divine dew settling upon his spirit, cleansing it of the day's dust, replenishing its vitality, and imparting a fresh, quiet radiance that would be evident when he awoke. This was the dew of Hermon, spoken of in the Psalms, a symbol of God's abundant blessing and life-giving presence, descending upon his beloved, even in the hidden hours of the night. The stone walls of his small cabin, which had stood for generations against the mountain winds and winter snows, were a physical representation of the unshakable refuge Caleb found in his God. And within these walls, in the vulnerability of his deep sleep, he was experiencing the profound reality of that divine protection. He was not alone in his solitude. He was enfolded in a love that was stronger than any stone, more enduring than any mountain. This deep cellular knowing of being safe, of being cherished, formed the very foundation of his restorative rest. It was the peace that comes from absolute trust, the trust of a child asleep in its father's house, knowing that all true watchfulness, all ultimate care, resides with that loving parent. Consider the biblical promise. My presence will go with you and I will give you rest. This was not just a promise made to Moses in the wilderness. It was a living reality for Caleb in his secluded valley. The divine presence was not something he had to strive to attain. It was a constant and unwavering companion, and in that presence, true rest. Rest for the body, rest for the mind, rest for the soul, was not just a possibility, but a guaranteed outcome. His act of surrendering to sleep each night was an act of faith in that promise, a confident expectation that he would be met, held, and renewed. And that faith was never disappointed. The deeper he sank into the oblivion of sleep, the more profoundly he seemed to be immersed in the tangible reality of God's peace. The utter stillness that enveloped him was not the stillness of absence, but the stillness of fullness. It was the stillness of a perfectly balanced ecosystem, where every element is in harmonious relationship. It was the stillness of a deep, clear lake, its waters undisturbed, perfectly reflecting the infinite sky above. In this profound quietude, the often faint whisper of the spirit was not a mere suggestion, but a pervasive atmosphere, a palpable reality that infused his entire being. This was the quietness and trust in which, as Isaiah had promised, his strength would be found. His trusting surrender to sleep was the pathway to that quietness, and in that quietness, his spiritual batteries were being recharged, his inner reserves replenished, not by his own effort, but by the effortless grace of God. The flock in the boma outside slept on, their own animal instincts assuring them of their shepherd's proximity and care, even if they were unaware of the deeper spiritual watch being kept over him. And in this, there was a beautiful, unspoken symmetry. The earthly shepherd, responsible for his woolly charges, was himself a cherished sheep in the flock of the great shepherd, resting securely under a care infinitely more profound, infinitely more encompassing. This understanding, though dormant in his conscious mind, was alive in his spirit, contributing to the depth and sweetness of his rest. He was a keeper who was being kept, a guardian who was being guarded, a shepherd who was being perfectly shepherded. The night wore on, the stars wheeled in their majestic silent courses, and the valley of Eldoria lay bathed in the soft, ethereal light of the moon. And in his humble cabin, Caleb, the man of quiet faith, slept a sleep so deep, so peaceful, it seemed to borrow from the tranquility of heaven itself. He was far from the world's turmoil, far from its anxieties, far from its fleeting, superficial remedies for restlessness. He was in the heart of God's peace, being renewed at the very core of his being, prepared by divine love for the challenges and the joys that a new day would inevitably bring. The silence of the valley was a holy silence, and the sleep of its shepherd was a sacred trust, profoundly kept. The profound velvet cocoon of the deepest night held Caleb in its unwavering, gentle embrace, a sacred interlude where the boundaries between the temporal and the eternal seemed to dissolve into a seamless continuum of peace. His physical form, utterly yielded to the soft support of his sheepskin bed, was a portrait of absolute repose, every muscle unknotted, every nerve quiescent. The only rhythm was the slow, almost imperceptible rise and fall of his chest, a breathing so profound, and even it mirrored the deep ancient respiration of the sleeping earth itself. The great silent sentinels of the mountains that ringed Eldoria stood guard around his valley, their dark masses a symbol of unshakable strength. And within this natural fortress, Caleb rested, his spirit as untroubled and serene as the starlit sky reflected in a hidden mountain tarn. The peace that enveloped him was not merely an absence of disturbance, it was a positive, palpable presence, as if the very air in his humble cabin was thick with the incense of divine tranquility. Imagine a master artisan working with a piece of beautifully grained ancient wood, patiently sanding away any roughness, meticulously bringing out the inherent luster, revealing the intricate patterns that lie hidden within. So in the deep, silent workshop of Caleb's sleep, the divine artisan was tending to his soul, the almost imperceptible splinters of past hurts, the fine dust of daily frustrations, the areas where life's inevitable abrasions had dulled the natural sheen of his spirit. All were being smoothed, polished, and restored with an infinitely tender, infinitely skillful hand. This was not a superficial buffing, but a deep, transformative process, realigning him with his original divine imprint, bringing forth the quiet, resilient beauty of a spirit wholly surrendered to its maker. The old was being made new, not through striving but through serene, receptive stillness. In these profound depths of unconsciousness, the concept of individual identity with its attendant anxieties and self-preoccupations, receded almost entirely. Caleb was not Caleb the shepherd, wrestling with thoughts of his flock or the changing seasons. He was simply a beloved soul, immersed in the boundless ocean of God's love, a wave indistinguishable from the sea, a spark at one with the eternal flame. This was not a frightening loss of self, but a joyful liberation, a return to that primal state of unity where the illusion of separation vanishes and only the all-encompassing reality of divine fellowship remains. In this state, there was no room for fear, no foothold for doubt, only the overwhelming, irrefutable experience of being perfectly loved, perfectly accepted, perfectly at peace. Consider the scriptural image of a tree planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season and whose leaf does not wither. Such a tree is deeply rooted, constantly drawing nourishment from an unseen, life-giving source. Caleb's spirit, in this profound nocturnal rest, was like that tree, its roots sinking deep into the underground river of God's inexhaustible grace. Though his conscious mind was dormant, his soul was actively, albeit passively, absorbing the living water of peace, strength, and divine love. This was the hidden nourishment that ensured his spiritual vitality, his capacity to bear the quiet fruits of kindness, patience, and unwavering faith in his waking hours, even when the external weather of life might be challenging. His resilience was not self-generated. It was drawn from this deep, secret wellspring. The physical body, that intricate and wonderfully made vessel, continued its remarkable, divinely designed work of restoration. Hormones of repair and rejuvenation flowed freely, uninhibited by stress. Cellular regeneration proceeded at an optimal pace. The immune system, often compromised by the subtle strains of daily life, was being fortified, its defenses strengthened. Every organ, every tissue, every fiber of his being was participating in this silent, sacred symphony of healing. The profound peace that saturated his spirit was not separate from this physical renewal. It was an integral part of it, creating the ideal conditions for the body to mend itself, to gather its strength, demonstrating the deep, inseparable connection between soul rest and physical well-being. The solitude of Eldoria, a choice Caleb had made long ago, or perhaps a calling he had answered, was a profound catalyst for this deep level of communion. Far from the ceaseless chatter and artificial urgencies of a more crowded world, his spirit was naturally attuned to the quieter, more profound frequencies of the divine. And in the utter stillness of sleep, this attunement became perfect, his soul like a finely crafted instrument resonating in perfect harmony with the silent music of the spheres, the unspoken melodies of God's love. The distractions of the ego were silenced. The clamor of worldly concerns was muted to an infinite distance, allowing for a pure, unobstructed flow of grace. Think of the biblical concept of Sabbath rest, not just as a cessation from labor on a particular day, but as a deeper spiritual principle of entering into God's own rest, a state of being where striving ceases and trust reigns. Caleb's nightly sleep, especially when it reached these profound depths of peace, was a lived experience of that Sabbath rest. He had laid down his shepherd's crook, symbolic of his daily labors and responsibilities, and had entered into a state of complete dependence, trusting entirely in the Good Shepherd to watch over him, his flock, his valley, his very life. And in that trusting surrender, he found a rest that was not mere emptiness or inactivity, but a dynamic, restorative fullness, a true participation in the divine rhythm of creation and recreation. The great silent amphitheater of the mountains stood witness to the profound peace that filled the valley. The stars, like a choir of distant ancient lights, seemed to offer their serene, twinkling antiphon to the deep, slumberous breathing of the earth. And Caleb, a single, humble inhabitant of this vast, sacred space, was at the very heart of this nocturnal symphony of peace. He was not merely an observer, He was an integral part of it, his own small spirit resonating in perfect accord with the grand, cosmic harmony orchestrated by the Creator. The stillness was not a void. It was pregnant with the divine presence. A silence more eloquent than any sound. A peace more profound than any earthly understanding. The shepherd of Eldoria slept on, his earthly cares forgotten, his spirit held, secure in the timeless, loving embrace of the shepherd of all souls. He was being renewed in the hidden places, refueled at the deepest springs, remade in the quiet fire of divine love. The night was a holy chalice, and Caleb was drinking deeply of its sacred contents: peace, restoration, and the unshakable assurance of belonging to one whose love knows no end, whose watchfulness never falters. The valley was a sanctuary, his sleep a sacrament, and his peace a profound and enduring miracle. The heart of the night in Eldoria deepened further, reaching that mystical point where time itself seems to pause, and the veil between the seen and unseen worlds grows gossamer thin. Caleb, adrift on the boundless ocean of profound sleep, was utterly immersed in a peace that felt less like an attribute and more like the very substance of existence. The great silent mountains that cradled his valley stood like ancient benevolent guardians, their peaks etched against the star-dusted canvas of the cosmos, and within their protective embrace, the shepherd rested, his soul as tranquil as a hidden alpine lake whose surface has never been stirred by a troubling wind. The gentle, rhythmic breathing of his flock in the nearby boma, a sound so familiar it was part of the valley's deep silence, served as an unconscious reminder of the simple, trusting lives under his care, a responsibility he had fully and peacefully surrendered to a higher, more encompassing shepherd for these sacred hours of rest. Imagine a master weaver, working with threads of moonlight and shadow in the absolute stillness of a secluded studio. With infinite skill and a deep, intuitive understanding, they are restoring an ancient, precious garment, not by adding new, jarring elements, but by gently strengthening the original patterns, reanimating the subtle hues, and ensuring the integrity of every fiber, so that its inherent beauty and purpose are renewed. So in the profound stillness of Caleb's sleep, the divine weaver was tending to the fabric of his being. The minute tears of daily weariness, the almost invisible thinning caused by unspoken sorrows, or the subtle erosion of passing years, all were being mended with threads of grace, compassion, and unwavering love. This was not a mere patching, but a holistic restoration, drawing forth the enduring strength and quiet dignity of a soul created in God's own image, preparing him to meet the world again, clothed in an inner garment of serene resilience. This state of profound unconsciousness, the ego with its ceaseless stream of self-referential thoughts, its anxieties about past and future, its striving for control and recognition, was entirely quiescent. Caleb was not Caleb with his concerns, or Caleb with his history. He was, in this moment, pure spirit, resting in perfect union with the Spirit of God, like a ray of sunlight indistinguishable from the sun itself. This was not oblivion, but a profound, liberating homecoming, a return to the essential truth of his being, where the illusion of separateness from his Creator dissolved, leaving only the joyful, irrefutable reality of an all-encompassing, unconditional love. It was a peace that originated not from the absence of problems, but from the overwhelming presence of God. Consider the scriptural metaphor of God as a refiner's fire, purifying silver and gold, removing the dross so that the precious metal can shine with its true brilliance. For Caleb, this deep, peaceful sleep was a different kind of refining process, not a harsh, fiery trial, but a gentle, alchemical transformation. The dross of his human fears, his accumulated stresses, his subtle self-doubts was being consumed, not by a searing flame, but by the quiet, pervasive warmth of divine love. What remained was the purified essence of his spirit, ready to reflect more clearly the light and character of his Maker. This was a sanctification occurring in the hidden depths, a gentle cleansing that prepared him for more authentic, more loving engagement with life. The physical body, that intricate and faithful companion of his earthly journey, continued its silent, divinely orchestrated program of deep restoration. In the absence of mental agitation or emotional stress, the body's innate healing mechanisms could operate at their peak efficiency. Nerves were soothed, tissues mended, and the subtle energies that animate life were recharged from an inexhaustible source. The profound peace that filled his soul was not merely a psychological state. It was a physiological reality, fostering an environment where every cell, every system, could return to its optimal state of balance and well-being. This was the holistic wisdom of the Creator at work, recognizing the inseparable link between spiritual tranquility and physical health. The story of Hannah, praying silently in the temple, her lips moving but her voice unheard, her heart poured out before the Lord in deep anguish, yet eventually leaving with her face no longer sad, had always resonated with Caleb. Though his own state was one of peace, not anguish, he understood that profound communion with God often transcended words. His sleep felt like such a silent, heart-to-heart communion. He wasn't articulating petitions or praises. His entire being was simply resting in God, an open vessel being filled, a weary child being held. And the result, like Hannah's, would be a discernible change, an inner lightness, a quiet joy that would be evident when he returned to the conscious world. This was the power of wordless prayer, the prayer of simply being in God's presence. The immense overarching silence of the Eldoria Valley night was the perfect cathedral for this deep, spiritual work, broken only by the most elemental sounds of nature, the sigh of the wind like the breath of God, the murmur of the stream like his constant gentle voice. It was a silence that stripped away all artifice, all distraction, allowing the soul to hear and be healed by the profound, unspoken truths of eternity. This was the wilderness where prophets had sought God, the solitude where mystics had found enlightenment. And Caleb, in his humble cabin, was an inheritor of that sacred tradition, finding in his solitary, peaceful sleep a depth of communion that many sought in vain in more crowded, noisy places. The great silent dance of the stars continued across the immense vault of the heavens, each distant sun a testament to God's creative power and his meticulous ordering of the cosmos. Their ancient light, traveling for eons to reach his secluded valley, seemed to carry a message of timelessness, of a reality far vaster and more enduring than the fleeting concerns of a single human life. Yet the shepherd knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that the mind which conceived and sustained this unimaginable universe was also the heart that loved him, that knew his name, that was, even now, tending to his rest with an infinitely personal, infinitely tender care. This marriage of cosmic majesty and intimate love was the paradox at the heart of his faith, the source of his unshakable peace. Caleb, the shepherd of Eldoria, slept on, a small, still figure in a vast, sleeping landscape, yet at the very center of a profound, divine attention. He was unaware of the wolves that might prowl the distant ridges, or the storm clouds that might be gathering far beyond the horizon. He was secure in a peace that was not of this world, a peace bestowed by the shepherd who never slumbers, the guardian who never fails. The night was a sanctuary, his cabin a holy of holies, and his sleep a deep, restorative sacrament, preparing him, body, soul, and spirit, for the quiet unfolding of another day in the eternal, loving presence of his God. As the deepest currents of the night in Eldoria began their almost imperceptible turn towards the distant, still unseen dawn, the nature of Caleb's profound sleep subtly shifted. It was not a lessening of its restorative power, nor a disturbance to its encompassing peace, but rather a gentle evolution within that peace. like the slow, majestic turning of a great celestial sphere, bringing new, though equally serene, constellations into view. The absolute oblivion of the midnight hours, where his individual consciousness had been almost entirely submerged in the ocean of divine presence, started to give way to a state still profoundly restful, yet perhaps allowing for the faintest, most delicate stirrings of his own unique spirit within that larger communion. The ancient silent mountains continued their vigil, and the stream murmured its timeless secrets, and Caleb, held within this sacred symphony, was being gently prepared for the gradual return to the world of sensory awareness, his inner being, saturated with a peace that had become as fundamental to him as the air he breathed. Imagine a master artisan who has completed the most intricate and vital restorative work on a precious, time-worn musical instrument in the deep stillness of the night. As the first, palest hints of dawn begin to filter into the workshop, the artisan might gently sound a single, soft note, then another, reawakening the instrument's voice, ensuring its timbres are ready to resonate anew with the music of the coming day. So it felt as if the divine artisan, having tended to the deepest restorations of Caleb's soul, was now beginning to gently touch the strings of his consciousness, not to jolt him into wakefulness, but to reawaken his capacity for perception, for feeling, for thought, all within the prevailing harmony of profound peace. The peace was not being diminished, it was being tuned, prepared to become the keynote of his waking experience. The absolute physical stillness that had characterized his deepest sleep might have begun to subtly yield. A slight, unconscious adjustment of his position on the sheepskins, a barely perceptible deepening of his breath as his lungs drew in the cool, pine-scented air with a fraction more awareness. These were not signs of restlessness, but the first, faint overtures of a body that had been fully mended and was now, in its own innate wisdom, beginning its slow, gentle journey back towards activity. It was like the first, almost invisible swelling of a bud on a tree in late winter, a silent, potent promise of the life ready to unfurl when the time was right. His muscles, having shed every trace of fatigue, now lay quiescent, but imbued with a fresh, clean energy, awaiting the eventual command to move. In this transitional phase, as he drifted in the serene shallows just below the surface of full consciousness, any inner experiences would continue to be gentle and affirming. The purely sensory, formless impressions of deeper sleep might begin to coalesce into more recognizable, though still dreamlike and peaceful, images. Perhaps a fleeting vision of his flock, moving like a slow, contented river across a sun-drenched meadow, or the feel of a newborn lamb, soft and fragile in his weathered hands. These were not dreams that would evoke anxiety or a longing for an unreal past, but rather soft, comforting echoes of his life's purpose, now viewed through the clarifying, beautifying lens of a spirit thoroughly steeped in peace. They were like gentle, encouraging whispers from the heart of his own deepest identity, affirming his connection to his calling, to the rhythms of creation. The ancient, steadfast presence of the mountains surrounding Eldoria, though not consciously perceived, seemed to exert a grounding influence even on his sleeping state. Their immense, silent strength was a palpable reality, a reminder of endurance, of things that last. The stream's gentle, ceaseless murmur, a sound woven into the very fabric of his existence, might now begin to register at a more subliminal level, not as a specific sound, but as a comforting rhythmic pulse, an auditory heartbeat of the valley that was also, in a way, his own. His profound disconnection from the external world was beginning a slow, almost imperceptible reversal, as his senses, one by one, prepared to re-engage, but to do so from a place of deep, unshakable inner calm. Consider the biblical account of Jesus after his resurrection, appearing to his disciples in the early morning light, often by the sea, a place of work and daily life for many of them. His presence brought not alarm but peace, a profound reassurance, a renewed sense of purpose. Caleb, in his own humble way, nearing the dawn of his consciousness, was not expecting a dramatic visitation, but he was experiencing a deep, abiding sense of divine companionship, a quiet assurance that the God who had watched over his night would also walk with him through the day. This was not a peace that would vanish with the darkness, but one that was preparing to greet the light alongside him. The profound sense of security, of being completely safe and tenderly held, which had been the hallmark of his night-long immersion in God's care, remained utterly intact. This was the unshakable foundation upon which his gradual return to wakefulness was being built. It was a peace so deeply integrated into his being that it felt less like a temporary state and more like his true original nature, restored and reanimated. This intrinsic security would ensure that his transition from the depths of sleep to the reality of the morning would be smooth, gentle, and free from any jarring disorientation. He was being carefully, lovingly acclimated, his spirit slowly recalibrating to the frequencies of the waking world, all while being continuously enfolded in that perfect, divine serenity. Imagine a deep, pristine well, from which water is slowly, carefully drawn. The surface level may gently lower, but the well itself remains full, constantly replenished from an unseen, inexhaustible spring. Caleb's spirit, having been filled to overflowing with the living water of God's peace throughout the night, was now in this state. As he began his slow ascent towards conscious awareness, he would be drawing upon this abundant inner resource. Yet the source itself, the infinite love and grace of God, remained undiminished, ever flowing. This unspoken understanding contributed to the profound calm that accompanied his gradual emergence from sleep. He knew, at a level deeper than thought, that he would not awaken to emptiness, but to a fullness that would sustain him. The darkness in his small cabin, though still profound, was perhaps losing some of its deepest intensity, subtly yielding to the almost imperceptible graying of the sky outside, far beyond the mountain peaks. This was not a change he would consciously register, but his body's own internal rhythms, perfectly attuned to the ancient cycles of light and darkness, would be responding to these minute cues, gently preparing his physiology for the shift from rest to activity. The delicate dance of hormones that had facilitated his deep sleep was now slowly, precisely beginning to reconfigure, paving the way for a natural, peaceful awakening. All of this was occurring beneath the surface of his tranquil repose, a masterful, divinely orchestrated symphony of renewal and re-emergence. The shepherd of Eldoria slept on, his great silent flock resting nearby, both shepherd and sheep held in the vast, benevolent embrace of the valley night. He was being prepared, not just to open his eyes to a new day, but to meet that day with a spirit renewed, a heart at peace, and a body restored, ready to continue his quiet, faithful service, under the watchful, loving gaze of the great shepherd. Of all, the transition from the sacred stillness of the night to the gentle stirrings of the dawn was as much a part of God's gift of rest as the deepest oblivion had been. A final, tender act of divine care. The gentle, irresistible summons of the approaching dawn began to draw Caleb from the profoundest depths of his valley sleep towards the familiar landscape of waking consciousness. The extraordinary peace that had been his constant companion throughout the night was not dissipating. Rather, it felt as though it were condensing within him, transforming from an all-pervading mist of serenity into a quiet, luminous core, a steadfast inner light that would soon illuminate his first perceptions of the new day. His body, while still enveloped in profound relaxation, was losing the absolute rock-like stillness of midnight's deepest surrender. A minute, unconscious flicker of his eyelids, a barely perceptible shift in the rhythm of his breathing as it deepened almost infinitesimally. These were not signs of disturbance, but the soft initial stirrings of a physical being that had thoroughly imbibed the balm of rest, and was now, in its own unhurried time, preparing to re-engage with the world. The great silent mountains of Eldoria stood as they had for millennia, their peaks perhaps just beginning to catch the faintest, most ethereal pre-dawn glow. And Caleb, within their embrace, was part of this ancient, sacred cycle of rest and renewal, his awakening as natural and as divinely timed as the sunrise itself. Imagine a skilled musician gently coaxing the first tentative notes from a perfectly tuned, ancient harp after a long period of reverent silence. The notes are soft, clear, and imbued with a profound resonance, not shattering the stillness but rather transforming it into a nascent melody. So Caleb's consciousness was beginning to stir. The absolute silence of his inner world was giving way to the first, faint notes of sensory awareness. But these notes were pure, harmonious, and perfectly in tune with the deep peace that had become the fundamental chord of his being. The journey back from the depths was not a jarring ascent, but a graceful, melodic unfolding, guided by an unseen, masterful hand. The subtle sounds from the world outside his cabin walls, which for hours had been unheard or merely part of an undifferentiated backdrop, began to crystallize into more recognizable, though still distant elements. The chorus of the stream, Eldoria's constant companion, might acquire a slightly more distinct gurgle and flow. The whisper of the wind in the high pines might carry a clearer soughing, a more defined voice. These sounds, still perceived through a thick, comforting layer of peace, were not yet demands or intrusions, but rather familiar environmental cues, gently reintroducing his mind to its surroundings, like friendly voices calling softly from a nearby room, signaling that the time to awaken was drawing near. His profound connection to this valley, his shepherd's attunement to its subtle language, was being tenderly re-established. In this serene borderland, this tranquil space between the oblivion of sleep and the clarity of full wakefulness, any ephemeral dream images would be gentle, peaceful, and perhaps tinged with a quiet sense of anticipation for the blessings of a new day. He might have a fleeting, sun-dappled vision of leading his flock to a pasture of impossibly lush green, or the comforting sensation of warm sunlight on his face. These were not the agitated, problem-solving dreams of an unquiet mind, but rather the soft afterglow of a spirit that had been thoroughly bathed in divine light, its usual anxieties washed clean, its perspective restored to one of simple, trusting faith. They were like the last, beautiful, dissolving images of a sacred tapestry, their threads of peace weaving themselves into the very fabric of his emerging consciousness. The physical sensations of his immediate environment were becoming more pronounced. He could feel the distinct texture of the sheep pelt beneath him, its soft woolliness of familiar comfort, the way his hand lay curled on the woolen blanket, the slight coolness of the air on his forehead. These were no longer vague, distant impressions, but concrete sensory inputs that his brain, slowly re-engaging, was beginning to process with gentle clarity. An almost involuntary sigh, deep and contented, might escape his lips, a physical expression of the profound well-being that permeated his entire being. His body, having been fully restored and rejuvenated, was now communicating its readiness to embrace the new day, not with a rush, but with a calm, inherent vitality. The deep relaxation remained, but it was now animated by a quiet, nascent energy, like a perfectly still pond just before the first breath of morning stirs its surface. Consider the biblical image of the dew of heaven, descending silently in the night to refresh the earth. Caleb felt as though his entire being, body, soul, and spirit, had been bathed in such a divine dew. He was awakening not to a parched inner landscape, but to one that was verdant, alive, and fragrant with the presence of God. This was the fountain of living waters springing up within him, a source of refreshment and resilience that would sustain him through the known and unknown experiences of the day ahead. This was not a fleeting good mood, but a fundamental reset, a return to his true spiritual center where peace reigned supreme. The unwavering peace that had been his constant companion and protector throughout the night now felt less like an external shield and more like an intrinsic quality of his own spirit, as if his soul had absorbed its very essence. This indwelling peace was his steadfast anchor as he neared the threshold of the waking world. It was the peace of God which surpasses all understanding, acting as a gentle, wise gatekeeper, ensuring that his first conscious thoughts and perceptions would be received into an atmosphere of serene acceptance, not into a flurry of renewed anxieties. This was the enduring, transformative gift of his night of surrendered rest, a qualitative change in his inner state that would, with grace, inform his entire day. Imagine a perfectly crafted sailboat, having found safe and tranquil anchorage through a long, dark night, now gently rocking in the calm waters of a sheltered cove. As the first light of dawn touches the horizon, the storms are past, the journey's weariness is forgotten, and there is a sense of peaceful readiness for whatever the new day's voyage may bring. Silas's journey through the night of sleep was reaching this gentle, beautiful conclusion. The deepest waters of unconsciousness were now behind him, and he was drifting peacefully in the calm, sun-kissed shallows just off the shore of full awareness. His inner sails were furled, not in defeat, but in quiet gratitude for a passage safely made, his anchor of profound peace holding him steady as he prepared to step ashore into the moments of a new day. The profound silence within his rustic cabin was now subtly different. It was no longer the absolute, almost breathless silence of the deepest night, but the more expectant, vibrant hush of a world on the very brink of dawn. A silence that seemed to listen, to anticipate. The subtle energies of the new day were gathering strength, both in the vast valley outside and within the rested core of his own being. The clean, earthy scent of Eldoria, pine, damp soil, and the faint, sweet aroma of distant wildflowers might become more discernible to his slowly reawakening senses, a familiar and beloved perfume. His identity as Caleb, the shepherd of this valley, a man of simple faith and quiet strength, was gently re-emerging, not as a burden of responsibility, but as a cherished calling, now to be approached with a spirit profoundly refreshed and renewed. The unseen, loving hand that had guided him into the sanctuary of sleep, that had watched over him with unwavering tenderness through the darkest hours, was now just as gently, just as skillfully, guiding him towards the clear light of a new morning. There was no abruptness, no jarring summons, only a slow, graceful, organic unfurling, like a mountain flower opening its petals to the first kiss of the sun. The deep, pervasive sense of having been cherished, protected, and unconditionally loved throughout his vulnerability was the unshakable foundation upon which his return to the world was being built. He was approaching the edge of full wakefulness, not with any reluctance or trepidation, but with a quiet sense of welcome, a peaceful readiness to meet whatever the new day might hold, fortified by a night of truly divine rest. The final, delicate veils of sleep were thinning, preparing to lift with the same exquisite tenderness and grace that had characterized his entire nocturnal pilgrimage into the heart of God's peace. The gentle yet irresistible call of the dawning day had now drawn Caleb to the very threshold separating the profound peace of sleep from the clear awareness of the waking world. He hovered in this beautiful, liminal space, not with any reluctance to leave the sanctuary of his rest, but with a serene readiness, his entire being still saturated with the tranquility that had been his constant companion through the night. His body, deeply rested and restored, lay in a state of perfect, relaxed equilibrium. Yet within that stillness, there was a subtle, nascent energy, a quiet hum of vitality, like a well-tended garden in the cool of early morning, its plants refreshed by dew and ready to receive the sun's warmth. His breathing, still as even and as gentle as the softest breeze sighing through the high pasture grasses, had acquired a subtle depth, a quiet anticipation of the more conscious, invigorating breaths, of full wakefulness, The great silent peaks of Eldoria, now catching the first direct kiss of the sun on their highest crags, stood as immutable witnesses to the daily miracle of renewal. And Caleb, a humble son of this valley, was an integral part of that timeless, sacred rhythm. Imagine a master musician, having lovingly restored an ancient, treasured stringed instrument, now holding it with tender reverence, poised to draw forth its first notes into the expectant silence of a new morning. The instrument is not merely repaired, it is retuned, its wood seasoned, its strings resonating with a new depth and clarity. So Caleb's spirit, emerging from the divine workshop of his night's rest, felt not just rested, but retuned, its capacity for perceiving beauty, for experiencing joy, for expressing love, subtly enhanced, its inherent harmony with its creator restored to a purer pitch. The peace he had absorbed was not a mere pause in anxiety, but a positive recalibration of his entire being, a return to his true, God-given frequency of serenity. The sounds of the awakening valley were now distinct and clear, filtering through the sturdy walls of his cabin, not as interruptions to his peace, but as the familiar, cherished melody of his daily existence. The chorus of the stream, Eldoria's liquid soul, was the articulate song of movement and life. The calls of the birds, the cheerful chirp of a nearby sparrow, the distant fluting song of a meadowlark, were sharp and individual, weaving a vibrant tapestry of natural sound. Even the occasional soft bleat from the sheep in the boma, now stirring with the approaching day, was a comforting, familiar note. His auditory senses were fully re-engaging, but they were doing so from a place of profound inner stillness, allowing him to receive these sounds with a heightened appreciation, a peaceful awareness. In this serene margin, where the last veils of sleep were as thin as morning mist, any fleeting images or thoughts that arose in his mind were gentle, luminous, and imbued with the profound peace that had become his core. He might see, with his inner eye, a dew-kissed spiderweb, strung like a net of diamonds between blades of grass, or the image of a single, perfect wildflower opening its petals to the dawn. These were not the demanding, problem-laden thoughts of a mind still caught in the day's toils, but rather the quiet, appreciative observations of a spirit that had been bathed in divine beauty. Its focus shifted from the burdensome to the grace-filled. They were like the first delicate flowers of a new day, blossoming in the fertile soil of his rested soul. The physical sensations of his immediate environment were now vivid and present. He could feel the soft, slightly coarse texture of the hand-woven woolen blanket against his skin, the way the packed straw of his mattress contoured to his form, the gentle coolness of the morning air on his face. A slow, deliberate stretch might extend through his limbs, a conscious, pleasurable reawakening of his physical being, an act of gratitude for its restored strength and flexibility. His body, having been completely rejuvenated during the night, was signaling its quiet, energetic readiness to embrace the tasks and movements of the new day, not with a sense of obligation, but with a cheerful willingness. The deep relaxation remained, but it was now alive with a gentle, purposeful vitality, like a river gathering its currents before flowing powerfully to the sea. Consider the biblical passage where God breathes into man the breath of life, and man becomes a living soul. While Caleb was already a living soul, his emergence from the profound peace of sleep felt like a miniature reenactment of that divine impartation of life. He was awakening not merely to existence, but to a heightened sense of aliveness. His spirit quickened, his senses sharpened, his heart filled with a quiet joy that seemed to emanate from the very breath of God within him. This was the gift of true rest, not just a reprieve from weariness, but a reinfusion of spiritual life, a resetting of his entire being to a state of greater wholeness and peace. The divine peace that had been his protective cloud and his guiding pillar throughout the night now felt undeniably, joyfully, an intrinsic part of him, like the very blood in his veins, the very marrow in his bones. It was not a fleeting mood he had to strive to maintain, but the settled natural climate of his soul, a gift received in humility, and now possessed with a quiet, unshakable confidence. As he hovered on the immediate brink of opening his eyes, to the new day, this indwelling peace was the calm, clear lens through which he would perceive his world, the steady, unwavering compass by which he would navigate its moments. It was the shalom of God, that all-encompassing well-being, acting as a wise and gentle guardian of his heart and mind. Imagine a tranquil mountain lake at the precise moment the sun crests the eastern peaks, its golden light flooding the scene, transforming the still, dark waters into a dazzling expanse of liquid brilliance. The mists of night have vanished, the shadows have fled, and the world is revealed in its fresh, pristine glory. Caleb's state of mind was mirroring this magnificent natural event. The deepest immersion in sleep was definitively past, and the clear, bright light of full waking consciousness was about to dawn. He was suspended in this exquisite, luminous moment, where the profound blessings of his night of sacred rest were fully realized, and the robust, joyful invitation of the new day was a welcome, thrilling call. This was the perfect, serene culmination of his nocturnal pilgrimage, a gentle, triumphant arrival. The profound silence that had characterized the sanctum of his cabin during the deepest night was now replaced by a silence that was vibrant, alive with the expectant energies of the morning. The fresh, invigorating scent of Eldoria in the dawn, a complex perfume of pine resin, damp earth, crushed herbs, and the clean tang of mountain air, would be a distinct and beloved aroma to his fully reawakened senses. His identity as Caleb, the shepherd of this valley, a man whose life was a testament to simple faith and quiet resilience, was now fully, joyfully re-emerging, not as a list of responsibilities, but as a cherished, God-given vocation, now to be lived out with. A spirit profoundly refreshed, renewed, and overflowing with peace. The unseen, loving hand of the great shepherd, which had led him through the dark valleys of sleep with such tender care, was now just as gently, just as surely, guiding him to the sunlit uplands of a new morning. There was no sense of being hurried or jolted, only a natural, graceful emergence, like a seed responding to the irresistible call of the sun. The deep, pervasive sense of having been cherished, protected, and unconditionally loved was the unshakable bedrock upon which his return to the world was confidently built. He was approaching the act of opening his eyes not with any apprehension, but with a quiet sense of joyful anticipation, a peaceful eagerness to embrace whatever the new day might hold, profoundly fortified by a night of truly divine, life-giving rest. The final, beautiful veil of sleep was about to lift, revealing a world waiting to be met with a heart full of peace and a spirit bathed in the glorious light of God's unending love. With a gentle sigh of profound contentment, Caleb opened his eyes to the soft, diffused light of his cabin, now brightened by the full assurance of the risen sun, though its direct rays had not yet penetrated the deep-set window of his sleeping alcove. The transition from the serene borderlands of sleep to full waking awareness was seamless, a graceful passage rather than an abrupt arrival. His first conscious perception was not of his surroundings, but of the extraordinary peace that resided within him, a deep, tranquil pool undisturbed by any ripple of anxiety or unease. It was the peace of a soul utterly at rest, thoroughly renewed, a peace that felt as natural and as integral to his being as the steady beat of his own heart. He lay still for a few moments, savoring this exquisite state, allowing the quiet joy of it to permeate every fiber of his consciousness, a silent offering of gratitude for the night's profound, healing grace. He became aware of the sounds of his valley waking around him, no longer muted or distant, but clear and distinct, yet still received through the calming filter of his inner serenity. The cheerful, busy chorus of the birds outside his window, The gentle rhythmic murmur of the stream as it made its way over smooth stones, even the occasional soft bleating from the sheep in the nearby boma. These were the familiar, comforting sounds of his world, and today they seemed to hold a special sweetness, a clarity that spoke of new beginnings. His senses, sharpened and cleansed by the night's rest, were keenly alive, yet his mind remained a still pond, reflecting these perceptions without being agitated by them. This was the gift of a truly rested spirit, an enhanced capacity for appreciation, a peaceful engagement with the world. Slowly, with a sense of unhurried purpose, Caleb sat up, his movements fluid and easy. There was no stiffness in his limbs, no lingering grogginess in his mind. He felt an invigorating lightness, a quiet energy that seemed to spring from a deep, internal wellspring. His gaze fell upon the small carved wooden sheep on the mantelpiece, its faded paint and worn contours a familiar, comforting sight. Today, it seemed to stand as a small, silent testament to the faithfulness of the great shepherd, who had watched over him, the earthly shepherd, through the night. A gentle smile touched his lips, a smile of deep, quiet understanding and heartfelt thankfulness. The anxieties that had briefly shadowed his thoughts the previous evening felt like distant, half-forgotten dreams, their power utterly dispelled by the potent reality of the peace he now possessed. He rose from his bed, his bare feet finding the cool, familiar smoothness of the cabin's stone floor. The simple act of standing, of feeling his weight on the earth, felt good, grounding. He walked to the small window, pushing aside the simple sheepskin curtain that covered it at night. The valley of Eldoria lay before him, bathed in the clear, bright light of a new morning. The high peaks that cradled his home were sharply defined against a sky of brilliant, cloudless blue. The pastures, still glistening with dew, were a vibrant, welcoming green. The air that drifted in, cool and pine-scented, was like a tonic, invigorating and pure. He breathed it in deeply, a conscious act of welcoming the new day, of receiving its blessings with an open, grateful heart. The beauty of his valley, a beauty he had witnessed countless times, seemed new today, as if he were seeing it for the first time with eyes that had been truly washed clean. His first thoughts were not of the day's chores, the demands of his flock, or any potential problems that might arise. Instead, a simple, profound wave of gratitude washed over him, so powerful it almost brought tears to his eyes. Gratitude for the gift of life, for the beauty of creation, for the unwavering love and faithfulness of God that had been his shield and his comfort through the night, and was now his strength and his joy in the morning. He remembered the scriptures that spoke of God's mercies being new every morning, and he felt the truth of those words resonating in the deepest part of his being. This peace, this strength, this clarity, these were mercies, freshly bestowed, undeserved yet freely given. "Great is thy faithfulness," he whispered, the words a heartfelt echo of the prophet's ancient song, his voice a little husky with emotion. Still standing at the window, he closed his eyes for a moment, not in formal prayer, but in a silent, intentional act of communion. He offered the new day back to its giver, dedicating his thoughts, his words, his actions to God's service. He asked for wisdom to be a good shepherd, for patience to meet any challenges, for a heart that would remain open to the subtle promptings of the Spirit throughout the hours ahead. It was a simple prayer, born not of duty or ritual, but of a deep, abiding desire to live his life in conscious partnership with the divine. This brief, silent consecration of the day was becoming an essential part of his morning rhythm, a way of carrying the sacred peace of the night into the often profane realities of the day. He turned from the window, a quiet sense of purpose now animating his movements. The profound peace remained, but it was now tinged with a gentle, joyful energy, a readiness to engage with the tasks ahead. He moved towards the hearth, intending to rekindle the embers for his morning tea. But even this simple, routine action felt different today. There was no sense of drudgery, no weariness at the thought of the day's labors. Instead, there was an eagerness, a quiet anticipation of participating once more in the good, honest work that was his life's calling. He was not just facing another day. He was stepping into another opportunity to experience God's presence, to extend his care, to live out his faith in the small, tangible ways that his shepherd's life afforded. The worries that had briefly surfaced the night before, the aging ram, the lean pasture, the unspoken concerns for his own future, had not entirely vanished from his memory, but they had lost their power to disturb his inner equilibrium. They were now held within a larger context of trust, of knowing that he was not solely responsible for every outcome, that a wisdom far greater than his own was at work. He would do his part diligently and faithfully, but the ultimate results, the ultimate solutions, rested in God's hands. This understanding was a profound liberation, allowing him to approach his responsibilities with a lighter heart, a more peaceful mind. As he coaxed the embers back to life, watching the first small flames begin to lick at the kindling, he felt a deep sense of hope, not a vague wishful thinking, but a solid, reasoned hope, rooted in the proven faithfulness of God. If God could bring him through the darkness of night with such profound peace and renewal, then surely he could guide him through the light of day, providing all that was necessary for each moment. This was not a guarantee of an easy, trouble-free existence, but an assurance of constant companionship, of unfailing love, of sufficient grace. And with that assurance, Caleb, the shepherd of Eldoria, felt ready, profoundly ready, to embrace the new day. His heart filled with a peace that was as vast and as serene as the mountain valley that was his home. The gift of sleep had been fully received, and its blessings were now the quiet, luminous foundation upon which he would build the hours to come. The rekindled fire in the hearth crackled cheerfully, sending dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls of Caleb's cabin and filling the small space with a welcoming warmth that dispelled the last vestiges of the night's chill. The shepherd moved with a quiet, deliberate grace, his actions unhurried yet efficient as he prepared his simple morning meal. A small pot of porridge bubbling gently over the flames, the aroma of oats and wood smoke mingling pleasantly in the cool morning air. The profound peace that had saturated his being during his night of restorative sleep was not a distant memory, but a living, breathing presence within him, coloring his every perception, informing his every movement. It was as if the serene stillness of the Eldoria Valley at midnight had taken up residence in his soul, a tranquil reservoir from which he could draw throughout the coming day. His hands, though weathered and strong from years of a shepherd's labor, felt supple and responsive, his body light and filled with a quiet, steady energy. He ate his porridge slowly, seated on a simple wooden stool near the open cabin door, allowing the fresh, crisp morning air and the first direct rays of the sun, now clearing the eastern mountain peaks, to flood into his small dwelling. The valley outside was alive with the sounds and sights of a new day. Sheep were stirring in the boma, their occasional soft bleats a gentle chorus. Birds sang with unrestrained joy in the nearby pines. The stream sparkled and gurgled as it hurried on its timeless journey. Caleb observed it all with a deep sense of appreciation, his heart filled with a quiet gratitude. The world felt new-minted, pristine, and his own spirit, thoroughly cleansed and renewed by the night's sacred rest, resonated with this fresh, vibrant sense of life. The anxieties of the previous evening, which had seemed like indistinct shadows in a moonlit landscape, were now completely dispersed by the clear, unwavering light of the peace he had found. He thought of the scripture that speaks of God's mercies being new every morning. This was not just a theological concept for Caleb. It was a lived reality. The peace that filled him, the strength in his limbs, the clarity in his mind. These were tangible mercies, freshly bestowed with the dawn. He felt a profound sense of being provided for, not just in terms of physical sustenance, but in the deeper needs of the soul. The rest he had received was not merely a biological function, it had been a spiritual transaction, an exchange of his weariness for God's strength, his anxieties for God's peace, his depletion for God's inexhaustible fullness. And this daily, miraculous provision was a source of constant wonder and unwavering trust. After his simple meal, Caleb began the familiar routines of his shepherd's day. His first act was always to check on his flock. He approached the boma, his old dog Shep trotting faithfully at his heels, young Bess already bounding ahead with exuberant energy. The sheep, recognizing his presence, gathered near the gate, their gentle, trusting eyes fixed upon him. He moved among them with a practiced, tender care, his hands gently examining a swollen joint here, checking the condition of a fleece there, speaking to them in low, soothing tones that they seemed to understand. His interactions were unhurried, his attention focused. The peace within him allowed him to be fully present to these humble creatures, to minister to their needs with a patience and kindness that flowed naturally from his own replenished spirit. He was not just their keeper, their provider. He was their shepherd in the deepest sense of the word, reflecting in his own small way the compassionate care of the great shepherd. He noticed the old ram whose slight lameness had troubled him the previous evening. Today, the ram seemed to be moving a little more freely, the swelling slightly reduced. Caleb felt a quiet sense of relief, a gentle affirmation that his concerns, once surrendered, were indeed being tended to by a wisdom and power beyond his own. He didn't attribute it to any miraculous, instantaneous healing, but rather to the natural processes of restoration, perhaps aided by the rest the animal had received, and by his own quiet, trusting prayer. It was a small thing, yet it reinforced his conviction that when he did his part, and then entrusted the outcome to God, things often resolved themselves in ways he could not have foreseen. This understanding was a cornerstone of his peaceful approach to the inevitable challenges of his life. Leading his flock out from the boma, Caleb began the slow, meandering journey towards the high pastures where the grazing was richest. The sun, now climbing higher in the sky, warmed his back, and the valley air was filled with the clean, earthy scent of dew-damp grass and wildflowers. He walked with a steady, even stride, his crook in hand, not as a weapon, but as a tool of guidance and gentle persuasion. His dogs, instinctively knowing their roles, moved with quiet efficiency, keeping the flock together, gently nudging any stragglers back towards the main group. There was a timeless rhythm to this daily procession, a ritual as ancient as shepherding itself, and Caleb felt a profound sense of connection to that long, unbroken line of those who had tended flocks, who had lived in close communion with the earth and its creatures, who had learned to read the language of the seasons and the sky. As he walked, his mind was not filled with anxious thoughts or mental to-do lists. Instead, it was calm and observant, taking in the beauty of his surroundings, the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves of the aspen trees, turning them into shimmering gold coins, the intricate patterns of lichen on an ancient, moss-covered boulder, the distant majestic flight of an eagle circling effortlessly on the thermal currents. The peace he had received during the night had not dulled his senses. It had heightened them, allowing him to perceive the world with a greater depth of appreciation, to see the fingerprints of the Creator in even the smallest details of his creation. This was not a passive, disengaged state, but one of active, joyful awareness. He found himself humming a quiet, tuneless melody, much like the gentle murmur of the stream that accompanied him on his journey. It was not a conscious act, but a spontaneous expression of the contentment that filled his heart. The usual internal dialogue, the self-talk that can often be critical or anxious, was silenced. In its place was a deep, abiding sense of well-being, a quiet joy that needed no external stimulus, no specific cause, other than the simple, profound reality of being alive, of being at peace, of being in conscious fellowship with God. This was the peace that surpasses all understanding, a peace that was not dependent on external circumstances, but flowed from an internal spring, constantly replenished by divine grace. The path to the high pastures was steep in places, requiring effort and attention. Yet even as he exerted himself physically, Caleb felt no sense of strain or undue weariness. The strength that had been renewed in him during the night was proving more than adequate for the demands of the day. He paced himself, breathing deeply, his movements economical and sure-footed, born of long experience. He was not fighting against the terrain, but working in harmony with it, his body a willing and capable instrument. And interwoven with this physical exertion was a continuous, quiet sense of God's presence, a feeling that he was not alone on this journey, that every step was accompanied, every effort sustained, by a strength beyond his own. The shepherd was leading his flock, but he himself was also being gently, powerfully led by the shepherd of his soul. The valley of Eldoria was not just his home, it was his sanctuary, his classroom, his place of communion, and the peace he found there, especially after a night of profound rest, was its most precious, life-giving resource. The flock spread out across the high alpine meadow, a sea of contented grazing white against the vibrant green, under a sky of brilliant, unblemished blue. Caleb found a comfortable spot on a sun-warmed granite outcrop, his back resting against its ancient, reassuring solidity, his crook laid beside him. From this vantage point, he could survey his entire flock and the breathtaking panorama of Eldoria Valley unfolding below, its patchwork of forests, streams, and smaller meadows stretching towards the distant hazy peaks that formed its western rim. The air here was thinner, crisper, carrying the faint, sweet scent of alpine wildflowers and the resinous aroma of wind-stunted pines. It was a place of immense, profound silence, broken only by the soft tearing sound of sheep grazing, the occasional happy bark of young Bess as she playfully chased a butterfly, or the gentle sigh of the wind as it swept across the open expanse. Here, closer to the sky, Caleb always felt a heightened sense of God's majesty and his intimate presence. The peace that had been his constant companion since his morning awakening felt even more expansive, more deeply rooted in this place of wild, unspoiled beauty. He watched his sheep, each one known to him, their individual personalities and quirks as familiar as his own. There was old Ruth, the matriarch, always watchful; young David, bold and inquisitive; quiet Mary, seldom straying far from her lamb. He felt a deep, abiding affection for these simple creatures, a shepherd's love that was both protective and tender. Their complete trust in him, their dependence on his care, was a constant, humbling reminder of his own dependence on the great shepherd. He knew he was far from perfect in his tending of them, that he made mistakes, that his patience sometimes wore thin. Yet he always strove to be faithful, to provide for them, to keep them safe, to lead them to good pasture. And in that striving, however imperfect, he found a deep sense of purpose, a quiet dignity. As the sun climbed towards its zenith, casting little shadow, Caleb drew from his weathered leather satchel a small, well-worn book of Psalms and a piece of dry bread and cheese, his simple midday meal. He ate slowly with mindful enjoyment, his gaze sweeping across the peaceful scene. The bread, coarse and wholesome, tasted good in the clear mountain air. The cheese, sharp and tangy, was a welcome treat. He drank from his water skin, the cool spring water refreshing and pure. These were simple provisions, yet they felt like a feast, enjoyed in this magnificent natural cathedral, far from the clamor and complexities of a world he rarely visited, but sometimes heard about from passing traders. His contentment was profound, a quiet joy that needed no external affirmation, no sophisticated pleasures. It was the joy of a man at peace with himself, with his work, with his God. This sustained peace, he knew, was a direct outflow of the deep, restorative rest the Lord had granted him. He opened the book of Psalms, its pages softened and browned by years of touch, and his eyes fell upon verses he had read countless times, yet which always seemed to speak anew to his heart. "The Lord is my rock, and my fortress, and my deliverer. My God, my strength, in whom I will trust. My shield, and the horn of my salvation. My stronghold." He read the words not as a scholar analyzing ancient poetry, but as a man who had lived their truth. This valley, these mountains, had been his schoolhouse. Here he had learned firsthand of God's steadfastness, like the unyielding rock beneath him. He had experienced God's protection, like an invisible fortress, through storms and dangers. He had known God's deliverance, not always from hardship, but often through it. His strength made perfect in Caleb's weakness. These were not abstract theological doctrines. They were the lived, experiential cornerstones of his faith, the bedrock of the peace that now filled him. He thought of Moses, who had led God's people through a vast and terrifying wilderness for 40 years, sustained by a divine presence that manifested as a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Eldoria was no wilderness in that sense. It was a place of abundance, of beauty. Yet every human life, Caleb mused, had its own stretches of wilderness, its own times of uncertainty, of feeling lost or alone. And what sustained one through those times was not human ingenuity or self-reliance alone, but the quiet, unwavering assurance of that divine pillar, that guiding, protecting presence. The peace he felt today, so robust and resilient, was a result of consistently choosing to follow that inner pillar, of trusting in that unseen guidance, even when the path ahead was obscure or the way seemed difficult. The night's rest had dramatically cleared his inner vision, allowing him to perceive that guiding light with renewed clarity. A shadow passed overhead. Caleb looked up to see a golden eagle soaring effortlessly on the thermal currents, its keen eyes scanning the valley below. He watched its majestic flight, a silent sermon in the sky about freedom, about perspective, about the beauty of a creature perfectly adapted to its element, living in entire accord with its created purpose. There was no striving in its flight, only a graceful, powerful mastery. Caleb felt a kinship with that eagle, not in its grandeur, but in the quiet longing for that same effortless alignment with God's will, that same joyful embracing of one's given purpose. And he knew that the peace he now experienced was a key to that alignment. For when the soul is at rest, it is more easily guided, more attuned to the subtle currents of the Spirit. The afternoon hours passed in a slow, peaceful rhythm. The sheep grazed contentedly, occasionally resting in the shade of a stunted pine or a large boulder. Bess, her youthful exuberance temporarily sated, dozed at his feet, while old Shep maintained a quiet, dignified watch, his gaze sweeping the perimeter of the meadow. Caleb sometimes closed his own eyes, not to sleep, but to simply bask in the warmth of the sun, to feel the gentle breeze on his face, to listen to the profound silence of the high country. A silence that was not empty but full of the unspoken presence of God. In these moments, there was no separation between prayer and being, between contemplation and existence. His very stillness was a form of worship, his peaceful contentment a hymn of praise. The deep well of serenity filled during the night was still overflowing. He noticed a small, fragile alpine flower, a vivid splash of purple, growing in a crevice of the rock beside him. How had it found purchase in such an inhospitable place? How did it draw sustenance from the bare stone? It was a tiny miracle, a testament to the tenacity of life, to the creative power of God that could bring forth beauty, even in the harshest environments. He reached out a finger and gently touched its delicate petals. It was a reminder that strength and resilience were not always about size or overt power, but often about adaptability, about a quiet persistence, about drawing life from an unseen source. His own peace, he felt, was like that flower, nurtured in the hidden places, by a power beyond himself, yet bringing a quiet beauty and resilience to his daily life. As the sun began its slow descent towards the western peaks, casting longer shadows across the meadow, Caleb knew it would soon be time to gather his flock and begin the journey back down to the safety of the boma for the night. But there was no sense of urgency, no feeling of pressure. The peace that had anchored his day remained steadfast. He felt a quiet readiness for the evening routine, a gentle anticipation of the rest that would follow. He had been given strength for this day, and he trusted that strength would be renewed for the next. He looked out over his flock, his valley, his world, and his heart was filled with a profound, simple gratitude. The Lord was indeed his shepherd. He truly did not want, for in the calm haven of a spirit rested in God, he had found all that he truly needed. The lessons of the night had become the wisdom of his day. The sun, now a great molten orb, began to dip below the jagged western peaks, painting the vast expanse of the Eldoria sky with breathtaking flourishes of incandescent orange, deep rose, and soft, ephemeral violet. Caleb stood, his tall, weathered frame silhouetted against the blaze of cosmic artistry, his old dog Shep at his side, young Bess already nudging the outermost sheep with gentle insistence. It was time to lead the flock homeward, down from the high alpine meadow to the familiar security of the boma in the valley floor. He watched for a few moments longer, allowing the sheer, unadorned glory of the sunset to imprint itself upon his soul. Each sunset, he felt, was God's own signature on the completed page of the day, a magnificent, silent benediction. The profound peace that had been his unwavering companion, a gift from the previous night's sacred rest, remained a calm, luminous presence within him, allowing him to witness this celestial drama not with a sense of fleeting beauty soon to be lost, but with a quiet, appreciative awe, knowing that the one who painted this sky also held his life, his flock, his valley, in an everlasting, loving embrace. With a soft, familiar whistle and a subtle gesture of his crook, Caleb signaled the start of the descent. The sheep, creatures of deep instinct and habit, responded readily, turning from their grazing and beginning to flow like a slow, woolly river towards the well-worn track that led down into the darkening valley. There was no panic, no confusion, only a peaceful communal movement, guided by the shepherd they trusted, the dogs they respected. Caleb walked at a steady, unhurried pace, his eyes scanning the flock, ensuring no stragglers were left behind, his senses alert to the subtle shifts in the evening air, the changing light, the sounds of the approaching twilight, the physical effort of the descent, navigating the sometimes steep and rocky path, was met with the same quiet, sustained energy that had characterized his entire day, a strength born not of anxious striving, but of deep, internal replenishment. As they moved lower, the air grew cooler, carrying the scent of damp earth, pine needles, and the first hint of wood smoke from distant unseen hearths. Perhaps a lone hunter's campfire, or the chimney of a remote homesteader in one of the smaller, adjoining valleys. The sounds of the evening began to emerge more clearly, the intensified murmur of the stream as it tumbled through a narrow gorge, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the first tentative hoot of an owl welcoming the approaching darkness. These were the familiar voices of Eldoria at nightfall, and for Caleb they were not sounds of menace, but integral parts of the valley's ancient, peaceful rhythm, a rhythm that resonated deeply within his own rested spirit. He was a man attuned to the subtle language of this wild place, and its nocturnal symphony held no fear for him, only a sense of belonging, of being enfolded in a natural order that was itself an expression of divine order. He thought of the many biblical passages that spoke of God as a light in the darkness, a lamp unto the feet, a light unto the path, As the shadows lengthened and the valley floor sank into a deep, velvety twilight, these metaphors took on a tangible relevance. He was leading his flock through a gathering gloom, yet he walked with an inner confidence, an assurance that was not dependent on the fading physical light. The peace that God had ignited within him during the night, and that had burned steadily throughout the day, was now his internal illumination, guiding his steps, calming his heart, enabling him to be a calm, reassuring presence for the creatures under his care. He knew that even if the moon remained hidden and the stars were veiled by clouds, this inner light, the light of God's presence, would not fail him. His mind drifted to the comforting imagery of Psalm 23, particularly the verse, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me." Eldoria was no valley of the shadow of death in any literal sense. It was his home, his sanctuary. Yet Caleb understood that life itself often involved walking through valleys of shadow, valleys of grief, of uncertainty, of fear, of weariness. And what enabled one to traverse those shadowed places without succumbing to despair was the unwavering conviction of God's presence, the comforting assurance of his guidance and protection, symbolized by the shepherd's rod and staff. His own simple crook, now used to gently guide a straying ewe back to the path, felt like a small extension of that divine, comforting authority. He was an under-shepherd, participating in the work of the great shepherd. The journey downwards was accomplished with the quiet efficiency of long practice. The dogs, Shep and Bess, worked seamlessly, their movements economical, their occasional low barks almost conversational, gently directing the flow of the flock. Caleb himself rarely needed to intervene. His presence, his scent, his familiar silhouette, often enough to keep the sheep moving steadily, trustingly, towards the safety of home. He observed them with a tender, watchful eye, his heart filled with a quiet affection that transcended the merely practical relationship of a man and his livestock. These were his charges, his extended family in this solitary place, and their well-being was a sacred trust. The peace within him allowed him to exercise this trust not with anxious overmanagement, but with a calm, confident vigilance. As they reached the familiar pastures surrounding his cabin and the boma, the last vestiges of twilight were yielding to the deeper darkness of full night. The first stars were beginning to blaze with a cold, clear brilliance in the vast, dark sky. The air was still, and the only sounds were the soft padding of hooves on the grassy earth, the gentle breathing of the sheep, and the distant, constant murmur of the stream. There was a profound sense of peace, of rightness, of a day's cycle, brought to a good and satisfying completion. Caleb guided the flock into the secure enclosure of the boma, its familiar stone walls and thorn branch reinforcement a welcome sight. The sheep settled quickly, their soft bleating a chorus of contentment, their bodies a warm, woolly mass in the gathering gloom. With the flock safely enclosed, Caleb secured the gate, a simple wooden hurdle. He stood for a moment, listening to the sounds of his sheep settling for the night, a feeling of deep satisfaction washing over him. The day's work was done. He had led them to good pasture. He had kept them safe. He had brought them home. And through it all, he himself had been led, had been kept, had been sustained by a peace that was not of his own making. He felt a profound gratitude for the simple, profound rhythm of his life, for the clear sense of purpose it provided, for the constant opportunities it afforded for experiencing God's presence in the heart of his creation. He turned towards his small cabin, where the faint welcoming glow of the dying embers in the hearth could just be seen through the window. The weariness in his limbs was more pronounced now, a pleasant, earned tiredness that promised a night of deep, untroubled rest. He looked up at the vast, star-strewn sky, and his heart was filled with a quiet awe. The God who had created this unimaginable universe, who held these countless stars in their courses, was the same God who had walked with him, a humble shepherd, through the simple routines of his day, whose peace had been his constant companion, whose strength had been his unfailing support. He felt small, yet infinitely cherished. He felt solitary, yet profoundly connected. He felt weary, yet deeply, wonderfully at peace. The invitation to rest was once more gently beckoning, and Caleb, his heart full of gratitude, was ready to receive it. The valley of Eldoria was settling into its nightly slumber, and its shepherd, a man of quiet faith and deep peace, was preparing to do the same. The door of Caleb's cabin closed with a soft, familiar click, shutting out the cool night air of Eldoria, now thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and enclosing him in the simple, rustic warmth of his small dwelling. The embers in the hearth still cast a faint, inviting glow, and the lingering aroma of wood smoke was a comforting, almost sacred perfume. He moved with the unhurried, economical motions of a man entirely at peace in his own space, his body gratefully acknowledging the pleasant weariness earned from a day of purposeful labor, a weariness entirely different from the soul-deep exhaustion that can follow a day lived in turmoil or anxiety. The profound peace that had been his serene companion since the previous night's restorative sleep remained, not as a fragile, fleeting emotion, but as a deep, steady undercurrent, a constant assurance of his inner well-being. He lit a single, tallow candle, its small, flickering flame pushing back the deeper shadows in the corners of the cabin, creating an intimate circle of gentle light. In this soft illumination, the familiar objects of his solitary life, the sturdy wooden table, the worn sheepskin throw on his bunk, the small stack of cherished books, seemed to exude a quiet welcome, a sense of belonging. He was not just in a shelter. He was home, in a place where every object, every shadow, every scent was imbued with the history of his life, his faith, his quiet communion with God. And tonight, that sense of home felt particularly profound, particularly peaceful. He didn't immediately prepare for bed. Instead, he sat for a while in his old hand-hewn wooden chair by the hearth, allowing the day to fully settle, allowing his mind to gently transition from the vigilance of his shepherd's duties to the receptive stillness that precedes sleep. He wasn't consciously reviewing the day's events or planning for the morrow. His thoughts, if they could be called such, were more like a slow, meandering stream, flowing without effort, reflecting the calm, starlit sky of his inner peace. The small cares that might have surfaced during the day, a ewe that seemed a little off her feed, a section of the boma fence that needed mending, had been dealt with or noted for future attention, and now they were released, not held on to with anxious tenacity, but entrusted to the quiet wisdom of the night and the unfailing providence of God. The internal landscape of his mind was clear, uncluttered, a serene pasture ready for the arrival of divine rest. He thought of the many biblical figures who had known solitude, who had found God not in the bustling crowd or the grand temple, but in the quiet wilderness, on lonely mountaintops, in the deep silence of the night. Moses on Sinai, Elijah in his cave at Horeb, John the Baptist in the desert, Jesus himself spending long hours in solitary prayer. There was something about being alone with creation, alone with one's own soul, that seemed to strip away the superficial, to allow for a more direct, unmediated encounter with the divine. Eldoria was Caleb's wilderness, his Sinai, his quiet place of communion, and he knew that the peace he so often found here, the peace that was so profoundly his tonight, was a direct result of that consistent quiet seeking, that patient waiting in the presence of God. His gaze fell upon his shepherd's crook, leaning in the corner where he always placed it. Its smooth, worn wood seemed to hold the memory of countless journeys, countless gentle nudges, countless moments of quiet vigilance. It was a symbol of his responsibility, his work, his identity. Yet as he prepared for sleep, he would lay it aside, both literally and metaphorically. He would entrust his flock, his valley, his very life, to the care of the great shepherd, whose crook was infinitely stronger, whose watchfulness never ceased. This nightly act of surrender, of entrusting all that he was and all that he had to God, was the key to his ability to rest so deeply, so peacefully. It was not an abdication of responsibility, but a wise and humble acknowledgement of his own limitations and of God's unlimited capacity. He remembered Jesus' words to his disciples, "Do not let your hearts be troubled. You believe in God. Believe also in me." These words, spoken in a time of great uncertainty and impending sorrow for them, had always resonated deeply with Caleb. His own life, though largely peaceful, was not without its subtle shadows, its unspoken questions, but the choice, he knew, was always whether to allow his heart to be troubled, or to consciously place his belief, his trust, in the unwavering goodness and sovereignty of God. Tonight, his heart was profoundly untroubled, not because all potential, for trouble had vanished from the world, but because his trust was firmly anchored, his belief a quiet, steady flame within him. The deep, restorative sleep of the previous night had powerfully reinforced that anchor, cleared away the debris of fear, and fanned that flame of faith into a brighter, more confident glow. The natural weariness of his body was now a gentle, insistent invitation. His eyelids were heavy, his limbs relaxed. The earlier alertness was softening, giving way to a pleasant drowsiness. He rose from his chair and made his simple preparations for bed. He added one last small piece of wood to the embers, ensuring a faint warmth would persist. He took a sip of cool water from the dipper in the bucket. He looked out the small window one last time, at the myriad stars blazing in the immense dark sky over Eldoria. Each star, a distant sun, a testament to God's unimaginable power, yet also, he felt, a tiny, friendly eye winking down at him, a silent promise of companionship through the night. As he lay down on his sheepskin bed, pulling the heavy woolen blanket over him, a profound sense of gratitude enveloped him. Gratitude for the day, for his work, for his flock, for the wild beauty of his valley home. But mostly, profound gratitude for the deep, abiding peace that had been his constant companion. A peace that was the fruit of God's presence and his restorative grace. He closed his eyes, and the familiar, gentle sounds of the valley night, the murmur of the stream, the whisper of the wind, the soft, contented rustling of the sheep in the nearby boma, became a soothing, sacred lullaby, drawing him effortlessly towards the welcoming shores of sleep. There was no struggle, no resistance, no restless thoughts to battle. His mind was still, his heart was at peace, his body was ready. He was like a tired child, surrendering himself with absolute trust into the strong, loving arms of his Father. His last conscious thought was not a specific prayer, but a feeling, an encompassing sense of being held, of being safe, of being utterly and completely loved. He yielded to the approaching darkness, not as an end, but as a gateway to renewal, a sacred space where the deepest healing, the most profound communion could occur. The shepherd of Eldoria, having faithfully tended his flock and steadfastly kept his watch, was now himself being gathered into the great silent fold of divine rest, under the vigilant, loving gaze of the shepherd, who never slumbers nor sleeps. The peace was profound, the surrender complete, and the promise of restoration, sure and certain. The gentle, irresistible current of sleep, born of a day lived in profound peace and a body honorably weary, carried Caleb swiftly and smoothly into the deep, restorative waters of the night. The last vestiges of his conscious awareness of the small cabin, the dying embers in the hearth, the ancient, silent mountains of Eldoria standing guard outside, all dissolved like mist under a rising sun, leaving only the boundless, tranquil expanse of his inner being, now fully open to the healing touch of the divine. His breathing, as slow and regular as the ancient rhythms of the turning earth, became the soft, anapestic meter of a sacred poem being written upon his soul, a poem of rest, renewal, and unwavering trust. The profound peace that had been the hallmark of his day was now the very essence of his sleep, an all-encompassing ocean in which his spirit floated, weightless and serene, cradled in the gentle, loving currents of God's eternal presence. In this sanctuary of deep unconsciousness, the sacred work of restoration, which had subtly continued throughout his waking hours due to his inner calm, now proceeded with an unimpeded, profound efficacy. It was as if his soul, having been carefully prepared and swept clean throughout the day, was now an open vessel, ready to be filled to overflowing with the pure, life-giving waters of divine grace. The subtle stresses that even a peaceful day might impart, the almost imperceptible weariness that accumulates in the sinews of body and spirit, were being gently washed away, replaced by a fresh infusion of vitality, of quiet strength, of resilient joy. This was not merely a cessation of activity, but a dynamic, active process of recreation, orchestrated by the Master of all life, lovingly tending to his beloved child. If any dreams traversed the landscape of his slumber, they were not the fragmented, anxiety-ridden phantoms of a troubled mind, but rather serene, luminous tapestries woven from threads of divine light and ineffable peace. He might experience a sense of walking through celestial gardens of unimaginable beauty, where every flower, every leaf, resonated with a silent hymn of praise. Or perhaps he felt himself enveloped in a chorus of harmonies so pure, so exquisitely beautiful, they seemed to be the very sound of God's love, healing and uplifting, his spirit at its deepest core. These were not mere figments of an idle brain, but sacred encounters, spiritual nourishments, that would leave their indelible imprint of peace and joy upon his soul, ready to be carried into the light of a new dawn. The great, silent mountains of Eldoria, their peaks now perhaps touched by the ethereal glow of a waning moon, stood as steadfast symbols of God's eternal, unchangeable nature. And Caleb, sleeping soundly in their ancient embrace, was a living testament to the peace that comes from resting in that unchangeable faithfulness. He was like a child held securely in the arms of an all-powerful, all-loving Father, his every need anticipated, his every vulnerability protected. The darkness of the night held no terror for him, for he was dwelling in a light that no darkness could extinguish. The inner light of God's presence, a constant, unwavering beacon within his soul. His flock, resting peacefully in the nearby boma, was a tangible reminder of the trust that simple creatures place in their shepherd. And Caleb, in his own profound sleep, was embodying an even deeper trust, a complete and utter reliance on the Good Shepherd, whose love knew no bounds, whose care never faltered. He had faithfully fulfilled his duties, and now, in surrendering to sleep, he was faithfully fulfilling his need for divine renewal, recognizing that his strength, his wisdom, his very life were gifts continually received from a gracious and abundant giver. This understanding, woven into the very fabric of his being, was the source of his remarkable, resilient peace. As the night progressed, marching silently towards the eventual promise of a new day, the profound work of restoration within Caleb continued, layer upon silent layer. His mind was being cleared of all clutter, his heart was being filled with all comfort, his spirit was being retuned to the perfect pitch of divine harmony. He was being prepared, not just for another day of shepherding in the valley of Eldoria, but for a continued journey of faith, a deeper walk with God, a more radiant reflection of the love and peace he had so abundantly received. The shepherd was being shepherded, the keeper was being kept, the beloved was being profoundly, perfectly loved. Dear listener, as Caleb rests in the deep, restorative peace of his Eldoria Valley, cradled in the unwavering love of the great shepherd, may you also find such sanctuary for your own heart tonight. Remember the quiet strength of the mountains, the gentle murmur of the stream, symbols of God's enduring presence and His constant, life-giving grace. Release now the burdens of your day, the worries that cling to your mind, the weariness that settles in your soul. Entrust them all to the one who promises rest to the weary, peace to the troubled, and renewal to all who seek Him with a sincere heart. Allow the gentle spirit of this story, the profound tranquility of the shepherd's faith, to guide you into your own valley of peaceful slumber. Breathe in His calm, exhale your cares, and surrender to the loving, restorative embrace that He so freely offers. May His peace be your pillow, His presence your protection, and may you awaken refreshed, renewed, and ready to walk in the light of His love.